This is Lead Time.
Welcome to Lead Time. Jack is off today as I get the privilege of hanging out with a brother who reached out to me, a little over a year ago, said, hey, I got a newer podcast and we're looking to start conversations with people who have diverse opinions across the LCMS with a desire for us to unite. And I was like, wow, that kind of sounds similar to some of the intentions that we've had on Lead Time and my own, formerly American Reformation, now my own podcast, wanting to learn with people inside and outside of the LCMS to unite in mission to make Jesus known. So he's Bryan Stecker. Bryan, how you doing, bro?
It's good to sit down with you again. I mean, it was nice to do it in person when you were here, but this is great too. Great technology.
Yeah, thank you. He is the host and creator of On the Line. If you've not checked it out, you definitely should. The hospitality, the intention, the desire to sit down face to face, because while technology is great, I love that you have that approach, and I love that your congregation is supporting that as well. He is also one of the, if you've heard of LIT, not ILT, no, LIT, Lutheran Institute of Theology. He's working with a number of theologians and pastors to provide a gift to the wider church. Not a pathway toward ordination. It is just training for lay leaders. And I think it's a wonderful pursuit. We need more of this in the LCMS. He's an associate pastor at Trinity Lutheran Church in Waconia, Minnesota. He studied business at Ball State and earned an MDiv from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne. He's living in Minnesota with his wife, Raylene, and their 3 children, soon to be 4th child, all of them under 5 years and under. And he is committed to equipping the church with engaging, high caliber theological content. So Bryan, man, what a joy to be with you. This is going to be a lot of fun. You mentioned, and we didn't get to go into it when I had the longer conversation than this is going to be. This will be around an hour or so. I love that you have long form. You're like Joe
2.5 hours.
Joe Rogan style, man. Really, really long. It's great. And it allows for a lot of conversation, a lot of different directions for people to get to know one another better. And I love it. So we didn't get to talk, though, about C.S. Lewis. That's where I wanted to start today. Tell me what you love most about C.S. Lewis and how he's kind of shaped your theological mind, brother.
Yeah. So, there's probably 2 routes. So, anyone that knows me knows he's probably one of the most influential teachers. And that's not to take away, of course, from the confessional training, Book of Concord, Bible, but, his kind of extracurricular individuals that have had an impact. And 2 things I'd probably say about him. I think there's been a subjective kind of impact that I can speak to, and then an objective. And the subjective one for me was I did grow up reading Chronicles of Narnia. So some of those kind of imaginative stories, I think, formed some of my imagination, which was helpful. But during college, as most people do, you kind of go through those kind of challenging times where you're questioning things and it kind of, trying to grit your teeth on being an adult. And that can be kind of rough. But I came across or kind of returned to or read for the first time The Great Divorce at like a particular time where I had some questions, kind of struggling through some things, read it in one night. And it was just an overwhelming experience. And it answered questions. It opened my eyes to things. I think it kind of reinvigorated some of that imagination that I had. And from there, that was kind of towards the middle of college. But that's kind of what I think started to get me interested in theology in a deeper way. So I started to go through his works. And the one thing that I've noticed is, so I've read through most of his works. Many of them I've reread. But something happens when you spend a lot of time with one author. And that is you start to learn not only what they've said, but you kind of learn how they think and how they process things. And Lewis is he's very much trained in logic. So when he goes through these questions, he articulates them very well. So I got to the point where I could say what Lewis said on something, but I could also make a pretty accurate guess of what he would say about something he didn't say, because I knew how he thought. I knew his framework. I knew the way he articulated things. So subjectively speaking, he formed the way that I think. He formed my imagination. And I do think that's one value of studying one person in depth is, if you just read one book or if you just read an article or something, you can take it out of context and you can miss what he's trying to say. But if you read a lot of one author, you can kind of get an understanding of their mind, and then you can place their points into that grander scheme. And I think that very much kind of forms you and gives you an accurate look of what this individual's thinking through and what kind of lens they're understanding things through.
Yeah, amen. I mean, anybody that's read Luther would say the exact same thing with great depth, as you've also read a lot of Luther. Like if we just, for case in point, if we just read on Luther and the lies of the Jews, or on the Jews and their lies, there we go. Like that would be a very poor, right? And some people do, right? They just know this kind of cursory understanding of who Luther is. But why, for that point, why did he say that? It's because he had a strong desire, along with the Apostle Paul, for the chosen people of God to come into a right relationship through the promised Messiah, Jesus. So go back to Lewis. What about the great divorce captured initially your imagination, and then use that as a springboard to help us think critically about things that maybe C.S. Lewis didn't say? So two-part question, but you think he'd speak into, and how would he speak into 2025 as we're going on mission to make Jesus known today, Bryan? So going to the great divorce.
Yeah, so the great divorce is, he's kind of taking his own version, and he's not really duplicating, but he's taking the same approach that Dante took in his trilogy, right? So there's kind of this pilgrim aspect, and he's answering the grander question of what is heaven and hell. And, so one of his theses is, he'll say, hell is the greatest monument to human freedom, right? And he'll also make the point that hell is locked from the inside. Point being, those who are in hell choose it, right? So that's kind of the grand overarching theme, but then he does it through all of these different conversations that Lewis is having in a dream or a vision, or kind of whatever it is. But what happens is he interacts with all of these different people who choose not to go on to heaven, but to return back to hell. And so it's a very reflective process. So like one that would be very applicable to someone like you or myself is there's an individual who's an apologist for Christianity. So he's all about like debating. And so Lewis is very much in this one reflecting on himself because he is in that role. But this guy's so interested in kind of debating the resurrection or debating the validity of historical things that he actually becomes uninterested in just kind of the beatific vision or actually understanding God or faith. So he actually refuses to go back. He wants to go back into hell because he wants to go back to these like conversations and debates and such. So it goes through a lot of different areas where it just kind of, it makes you introspectively reflect on your own conversations that you have, your own goals, what your life is geared towards. And it kind of breaks down those barriers. So that's one of the beauties of The Great Divorce, which is, kind of allegory. It's certainly fiction to where some of his works are nonfiction. So that's certainly one snapshot. Another one, if you kind of want to bring it into today, maybe I would say two things. This is kind of get into that objective realm of why I would endorse reading Lewis. So him, and you could throw Chesterton and Tolkien into this group too. And there's a couple others, but George MacDonald and such. But they're kind of on the last cusp of those that were part of like a true classical education. So educational reform was happening during Lewis's time. And that's why he writes like The Abolition of Man, which is a very prophetic book about the movement of education in the West. And so he's not an inheritor of that change. He's still an inheritor of the way that education was done, which means he knows how to read Latin. He reads all the great books. He knows Aquinas, he knows Augustine, he knows Luther, you go through he knows Dante, all of this. So for you or I haven't been trained classically, really. I think I got a little bit at seminary, but, some of those books, I can go back and read them, but they're tougher for me to grasp a hold of. For one, they're translated into English, which adds a level of difficulty. Right. Two, they're written in some ways that we're just not trained to read. But Lewis is an English speaker who has one foot in modernism. So he kind of understands our world still today. He's not too far back in history, but he also has one foot in the classical realm. So he's one of the great kind of entry points of understanding the wisdom of, the previous 1800 years. He's got access to that and he's able to articulate it into our modern context. So that's why I think he's very kind of prophetic in that way. And so what kind of things does he speak to? Well, he understands the first movements of modernism. So for instance, like where do ideas come from? If I go to the Mall of America, it's about 30 minutes from here, and I walk around, all the kids in the Mall of America are Marxists, right? Or they're Nietzsche. And it doesn't mean like they might say I'm not a Marxist, but those ideologies have seeped into our culture. But that doesn't happen in like 20 years. That happens, it takes 100, 150 years. So Lewis was seeing the first movements in the academic system, because that's where these things start. And then they move into the students, and then the students grow up and become influencers, and they educate the next generation. So eventually it just gets seeped in. So Lewis he had his finger on the pulse of what we're dealing with today because he was seeing the first movements of it. But I think he was able to wrestle with it in a clearer way because the air hadn't quite yet been polluted with these ideas. So yeah, that's kind of my endorsement for Lewis. And that's one of the reasons that I appreciate still reading him.
Yeah. Oh, so good. What are your thoughts regarding C.S. Lewis and the power of story? There's a number of philosophers today who are saying the Enlightenment vision, we are pure. We've completely walked past the Enlightenment vision that science and humans can figure things out, right? And that there's a grounding meta narrative that every human is attuned to, but again, hell is locked from but we'd rather not be connected as a creature in God's creation. The power of story, because Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, I mean, that's what really put him on the map. was the Chronicles of Narnia, right? And grounding people as a evangelical tool. It wasn't apologetics. It was story. Say more about where we find ourselves today in the power of story, Bryan.
Yeah, I might reference Tolkien here, in some of the questions we talked about beforehand. I think it'll apply well to, kind of what made a pastor. But he certainly is applied here. So one of the challenges I think like the church has today, or that we have, Chesterton puts it this way. So Chesterton says that the modern man needs to become a pagan before he can become a Christian, right? So once again, like if you don't understand Chesterton, you'd hear a statement like that and you're like, that's crazy. Why would you, but what's his point? His point is, if you look at like the pagan culture, John D. Davidson articulates this really well. There's a really dark side, but also they were built on stories, right? Just think like oral culture, right? So like stories are big. So what happens is it forms your imagination, stories do, and it creates kind of these narratives. And, so if you go to Africa, like missionaries in Africa will speak this way, where they'll say they have these stories of good and evil and battle in the spiritual realm. So when the Christian message comes in there, it affirms some of these things. It's like, yeah, like there is a spiritual realm. There is this battle between good and evil. And, here's where victory comes from. So you can fit into that narrative that's already there, the gospel message. So Chesterton's saying the modern man who has lost all imagination, lost these kind of proper, everyone's got a story, but lost these kind of deep meta narratives. And we've had a very simplistic, only scientific method type thinking that just naturally, once again, if you go to the Mall of America, some people might say there's a God, but for the most part, we operate as if there isn't a God. Like we're kind of practical atheists in the way that we live or think. So our stories are just kind of, they're down below the clouds, just kind of down here. So when Christianity speaks to that, it's got a two-pronged issue. Like one, it wants to articulate that truth, but it also needs to break through the clouds and kind of open up the imagination to understand the reality of the divine, the spiritual realm, like these archetypes that are flowing through. Story is a necessity to start to train children in this kind of imaginative process. So Lewis's trilogy, or Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, does this very well. I think Tolkien's trilogy, and you can go to Hobbit and such too, but Tolkien's work might be the best at this because they are richly, mythic in nature. So they create some of these narratives, and I could certainly speak more to that. But that's why I think story is so important, because you have to open up the imagination, because if not, it just becomes like doctrine. And doctrine is, of course, completely essential, but doctrine is supposed to also move us towards, it's like I can read a great systematic book, and that's necessary. But it's supposed to kind of move you then into, once again, that faith that's vibrant and believes and sees these kind of grandiose things that God articulates to us.
That's centered in a God who created, and his rebellious creation fell, and he loved that rebellious creation enough to send his son. And now through faith in his son, given by the sent Holy Spirit, we are sent in mission to make the triune God known. We've been grounded to the greatest story of all time, God's love for his fallen and rebellious creation. Praise be to God. So you mentioned Tolkien. I've heard the story that Tolkien looked at C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia and said, oh, that's kind of cute, like a lion and all this kind of stuff. Like, let me tell you another story. Like this is a deeper grounded story. Is there some validity to Tolkien and Lewis kind of giving each other a little bit of something? Were they competitive at all? Or it seems like they were really good friends, who just like to banter and lovingly challenge one another. Is that a true story, Bryan?
From what I understand, it is, and I think it probably gets. I think it probably gets
exaggerated. Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Obviously, they were best friends. They were Brits. Brits have that kind of humor, right? So I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were poking at each other, or maybe Tolkien more so at Lewis. That said, that they are doing two different things. Like Tolkien is very straightforward. I'm not writing allegory. And Lewis is like Aslan Jesus right there. If you go to Lord of the Rings, it's like, well, like Frodo is a type, Gandalf is a type, and Aragorn's a type. So, so it's not so straightforward. He's trying to like pull out elements of like, what's the King of Kings? What's kind of this divine wisdom coming down in Gandalf? And then of course, like the servant that suffers, the suffering servant is kind of Frodo. So he's much more nuanced. They're different audiences, right? I'm reading the Chronicles of Narnia with our 3 and 5-year-old, or at least The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe seems accessible to them. I can't open up the Fellowship of the Ring and go through 60 pages of like concerning hobbits with my young kids. So they're geared towards different audiences.
Yeah, that's good. All right, let's get into your story a little bit. How did you know you wanted to be a Lutheran pastor? Who or what most influenced you? Tell that story, Bryan.
Yeah, it's one of the questions you get asked, I think, the most. And I don't have a good answer. I don't have a great answer for it. I have to reflect back on it. It's just kind of one of the things that happened. It wasn't a long draw. So I didn't grow up wanting to be a pastor. One data point is my father was a pastor. I graduated college with business and psychology. I went and worked in Indianapolis. And it took a little while, probably, probably halfway into that, like maybe 6 months into that, the idea maybe started to creep in. And probably by 10 months, I was enrolled in seminary. So it happened very quickly for me.
Wow.
Now, so that's kind of the simple answer is, God works and, sometimes things just kind of happen. But when I reflect back, and this is where Tolkien kind of comes in or does come in, when I reflect back, I think what took place was these stories were placed in my childhood early on. So I would listen to first the abridged version of The Lord of the Rings, and then eventually moved on to the unabridged. And I would just listen to those when I would go to bed. So the stories were kind of deeply seated in me, right? So then I think, I got my degree. I went on and I was doing some entrepreneurship, and then I was doing logistics broking. And I was doing that, and there was a longing I wanted to be part of like the good fight. So in other words, like in these stories, there's this, battle of good and evil, and there's these characters you follow that go on the front lines. And there's even this great scene with Sam. I think it's in the movie towards the end of the second one, where Sam kind of gives this speech and he says, well, Frodo, remember all those stories that we read, the ones that really meant something, and how could everything go right when everything had gone so wrong? But those are the stories that really mattered. And maybe we're in one of those stories. And I think that kind of articulates that point is in that story, you don't want to be the Hobbit back in Hobbiton, like smoking your pipe and having a pint. Like you want to be Legolas or Aragorn or Frodo. You want to be on the front lines. And I think that's where that story kind of cultivated that in me. And although I couldn't articulate it at the time, I felt uneasy with my job because I felt like I wanted to be in a really important battle, like fighting for something that on my deathbed, I can look back and say that was a fight worth fighting. So I think that is what moved me in, was this battle for the West, this battle for good breaking into evil, dealing with these weeds that have grown up in our society that are kind of attempting to choke out this gospel light. And so wanting to be part of that battle was, I think, what drove me. Now, if you would have asked me in my entry exam to the seminary, I probably would not have articulated that. I'd have been like, I don't know, like I'm kind of interested in theology. And my dad was a pastor and he seemed pretty happy. So you kind of learn these things as time goes.
Yeah. Our stories are kind of similar with the dad being a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really know. We don't know much of anything, Bryan, to be quite honest. Truth has to be revealed to us. And I don't know how all of this is going to end. So the spirit of adventure and following, listening to the voice, and Jesus being out ahead, he's obviously within, but he's definitely on the move. And the call is to something like voluntary self-sacrifice for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of mobilizing leaders to know who he is. But if you have asked me at 26 years old, are you going to be having podcasts around all the topics that I've had podcasts? I don't know. No, it's not on the agenda right now. But the way God kind of made you becomes unfolded in time. And I appreciate the way the Lord made you. As you entered into your congregational life, what were you like, man? I was ready to go. And then what, so much of our work is on the job training, right? When you get in and each congregation has unique culturals. We preached cultural implications. We preached a sermon on the necessity for rituals and rites, but those rituals and rites are not for themselves. They are for something. They point us to, obviously, God in the divine service and his work for us. But there's certain things in our churches that are unique. We ring a bell 7 times out here. I know you have a bell as well, but if I were to get rid of the ringing the bell 7 times, it's like, that's not in the divine service, but we ring the bell here 7 times. At the end of the service, we say, God is good all the time. We have all of these kind of contextual rituals. I inherited a congregation that is very much focused on raising up leaders from within the congregation. Like that's a strong value. So what were you prepared for? And what were you like, wow, I didn't see that one coming. Anything there?
Yeah. So I think I was properly prepared in the way that I could be. So I think there's certain things you just have to learn on the job. So for instance, my very first day in the office, I had unloaded about half my books. So I still had boxes around, and a lady called, and it was her son had just committed suicide. Her son was a high school student, and they weren't members of the church. So day one, I was sitting down with this lady and the grandmother, so mother and grandmother, whose son had committed suicide. I think it was either that morning or it was the night before. And so I can confidently tell you I was not prepared for that. But I can also confidently tell you there's no way that I could have been properly prepared for that. And I would reflect on, and if I look back, I would have had that conversation different. That being said, it was appropriate for a pastor on his first job. And, I was able to articulate the gospel to them. I might have framed the conversation different, or, maybe gone into the sanctuary and spent a longer time praying. Point being, those kind of situations, the first time you're watching somebody die, there's just no way that you can be properly prepared. And there's a lot of situations like that. So, kind of what I valued in retrospect was I think that like the goal of like the seminary, like it's kind of trying to train your soft skills more than your hard skills. Because we had some practical classes that dealt with some of these counseling things, and I don't know how much I used what I learned in those classes, because you have to be in the situation, and you have to kind of react and adapt and then reflect and then do it again. So I think it was really just those soft theological skills that kind of polishes a way that you think and a way that you process. And I think that's my reflection, at least, is that that's one of the big things is you become kind of trained in that way. It's kind of the same with like sports or wrestling. I was a wrestler growing up, and when you wrestle, it's all about it's all about you understand your body becomes like water. Like you need to understand how's the other person moving, where's their weight distribution, where are they pressing, and it becomes second nature to where a good wrestler is not really thinking like, I'm going to do a half Nelson now. You're just responding, and so wrestling's all about kind of soft skills that then move into hard movements. And I think the pastoral training is the same too, where like it sets you up so that you can think theologically. You can think with a gospel-centered way on how you're going to communicate in these different situations. And then you get thrown in those situations. And then you come out and you go like, oh, that was tougher than I expected. And then I should have done this. And then you do that the second time, if that makes sense. So,
yeah. No, I think the best in theological formation is when you get taught how to think. There's frameworks, right? And not necessarily dogmatically what, but how. And I felt super well trained, and then you work it out as you get into the parish, and certain experiences, I can place myself back in the classroom with some of my favorite professors and draw on that wisdom. But it's not just one person, it's like a collective. It's kind of like the Holy Spirit is responsible for it, right? There's like a collective wisdom that comes. And so, yeah, shout out to everybody who works to train up the next generation of leaders. You're doing a mighty, mighty work, and we need more leaders being raised up, and I love and pray for everyone in our seminaries for sure. So let's talk about leadership. This is a leadership podcast, right, Bryan? And how is pastor, as you articulated right now in 2025, seen as a leader, and how is pastor as leader framed up maybe appropriately, and how could it be framed up inappropriately? How have you heard? And so just use some appropriate and cautionary language toward seeing pastor as leader.
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly with a lot of nuances. As I reflect on it, maybe I could go two angles. Maybe I'll kind of go first to where maybe it's, I don't want to rule this out, but this is not like the main focus. And that is, as a pastor, you're a leader within an area, right? But you're not necessarily a leader in everything, right? So, I think sometimes as a pastor, sometimes you can come with this notion, or I'll hear this notion articulated sometimes, where it's like you have to be a leader in everything, right? And that's not really the case. Like, I'm not trained to do certain things. So for instance, when it comes to like marriage counseling, so I do premarital counseling when I do weddings.
Yeah.
And we focus on, for the most part, like, what is the theology of marriage? Going into Genesis 1, 2, 3, getting into Ephesians 5, elsewhere, and kind of trying to paint a picture of here's the lens by which to understand how God articulates about marriage. And I've been married for, goodness, a handful of years, I think 7 years.
I'm 20. It's easy to remember. I'm 20 right now.
Less than 20, more than 5.
There you go.
So, I've got some nuggets of things that I've learned, but at the same point, there's couples in this congregation that have been happily married for 45 years, and they probably have a better capability of speaking to some of the practicalities of marriage challenges than I do. I've got 7 years of marriage experience and a great theological framework. So if you want a theological framework, I can lead you through that. I can also give you some tidbits based on my own personal experience, but that doesn't mean that I'm the go-to person for marriage, right? Now, maybe someone goes and gets an MA in marriage counseling or something like that where they have extra training. But, so there's a lot of areas within the church and without where, I say, I don't know, I give you my thoughts on this, or, well, here's something that God says, but, I'm not the end all be all, right? And I think that's an important clarification too, because sometimes you can feel like you have to wear all these different hats when really like your hat is, once again, your soft skills have been trained theologically to process the goodness, the truth, and the beauty of Scripture and how this is portrayed, and then how it interacts with the world around us. And you should be a leader there, and you should feel confident that you can speak within those areas with clarity, right? And with boldness. When you do that within its proper realm, and when you're confident about that, and when you truly believe it, and people can see that, right, in the way that you're passionate and you're excited and you're willing to jump in and tackle these things, or someone has a question and you don't have a right answer, like you're going to go research that and get back to them. Those are the areas where you should be leading as someone who is, all of the Paul's letters to Timothy, right? All these kind of things, like being a good father, being a good husband, having a good reputation, that you're living out this Christian faith as well. And then this kind of boldness and clarity and being excited to teach about it. And if you do that, then I think people will gravitate towards that. And then there's all these other leaders and influencers that come into their life within the body of the church in all these different areas, right? Yeah. Which is kind of that emphasis of the pastor is a pastor, and that's a essential and bedrock position within the church that needs to be kind of maintained and held up. But then there needs to be all sorts of other leaders, to your point, right? Like there needs to be elders, there needs to be individuals that are really good at finance, there needs to be all of these other people, and we need to be able to say, and this skill set is really important for our church too, right? They're not intermixable or interchangeable, but they're all important. So this raising up of leaders or the body of Christ that can do all of these different things, I think is very important.
Well, the Apostle Paul hits on that quite spectacularly in 1 Corinthians 12, Romans chapter 12, talking about the various gifts. I find it fascinating that both of those letters are written not to a person, but to the church, right? So the church is going to need Ephesians 4. They're going to need under the office of holy ministry. And I don't really want to go down the APEST pathway, but he does talk apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, right? And I would say that that's one office with maybe some different nuanced gifts. But nonetheless, there's going to be different roles within the church. And you better not lead from a place of positional power. You should be clear about what your responsibility are. And for us, it's word and sacrament, right? But man, there's a lot of things that are beyond that. Let me tease something that some of my friends would probably agree with, and others maybe not as much. And we're still brothers in our church body. What's the role of pastor as visionary leader? That's a loaded word, right? So thinking of so does the pastor, is there a vision Sunday? Is there a, here's where we're going, and here's kind of some of the strategy, maybe not all of it, but here's how we're going to get there. It's going to be fueled with love for us and for one another and for the world. You could make a case, and I just got off a podcast with an attorney, Alan Hoffman, who walked devotionally, it was fascinating, walked devotionally through Jesus's high priestly prayer in John chapter 17 and equated that to a visionary speech, right? My hour has come. I've done everything that's needed to be done. The cross is ahead, and then there's this future reality for what's going to happen on the other side, and you're going to be a part of it, disciples, and you'll have joy and stay united to one another in Christian love. And there's others who are needing to hear this word and believe it, and you're going to be proclaiming that word by the Spirit's power. So John 17, you could say Jesus is definitely offering a preferred future and the disciples' invitation into that preferred future by the Spirit's power. So any take on visionary leadership? I think this is where I think in our church body we should get clear with our language and not be flippant with it. So thoughts, Bryan, and I'll piggyback.
Yeah, I don't think this is an area of strength in mine, and that I haven't looked into this too much. And I'm an associate pastor, which means when a lot of these kind of macro decisions come, I'm kind of a consultant, but I can pass it off to Pastor Duncan and say, yeah, here you go, buddy. So there's that. One thought as you were speaking was, and this is more macro than micro, I guess, but I desire that you would be one as me and my Father are one. That language there. And I think that's something that should always be applied or taken seriously, right? And, we talked to Bill Weinerk about this, and he made a good point that unity is also that we would speak in unity, right? So there's kind of this theological integrity that is built into that, right? So like in the same way, it's not like Christ is saying you should be one with the Mormons, right? So it's, it's obviously not that, but there should still be this desire that, any kind of quick move towards fragmentation or splitting or anything like that, it does go against that spirit. And it doesn't mean there's never a time, right? Like obviously, as we as Lutherans would say, there was a time where, even though it wasn't the prime goal of the start of it, but there was kind of the split between Catholics and Lutherans, if you want to call it that way. But those were built over real issues that you couldn't break past. So there are those times, but any kind of at least emotional movement towards we should split and that kind of a thing, whether it's within a church or in a broader spectrum, that's never good.
No, I agree. I would say the pastors, to answer my own question, I don't think his primary role is visionary in the secular sense. Mm-hmm. I think there is a role for a vision toward reaching more people with the gospel, and then having the congregation with all of our varied gifts figure out how we go about doing that in our respective context. Mm-hmm. But hopefully a pastor would let us consider how to love and spur one another on toward love and good deeds, that there would be this kind of galvanizing, spurring on component to our preaching, because the days are too short to not want to reach more people with the gospel and give them a vision of what the true good life looks like connected to the triune God. That's great. Let's get into your podcast a little bit. Amazing success, reaching, a lot of people. I'd imagine mostly within the LCMS, but probably outside in the broader Lutheran community of those confessing Lutherans, of which there are a number of smaller tribes, even in the United States, and that kind of look to some of us in the LCMS, and we share in many respects a very, very, very similar confession. And so they're looking in and watching, your podcast, this podcast, and trying to kind of discern, where are we and where are we going right now? And I love that you kind of, we've dealt with some of the pain points, I would say, in the LCMS. Your aim is, as I can, from an outsider looking at it, isn't necessarily to do that, but to just set up a place for wonderful theological conversation. Say more on why you started On the Line, Bryan.
Yeah, the goal is definitely intellectually forward, right? And that might be kind of a niche. So I'll get out. I won't bring in the internals. So the internals are how Trinity united around this, and that's the only important thing to note. There is Trinity. My church has been completely behind this. This is not a Bryan Stecker thing. My call is associated towards this. At this point, that was a change, and then the district also supported it, not necessarily financially, but they said you should do this. We're in full support of it. So we had some unity around that. But really, where kind of the idea drove from was, I would strongly urge that the LCMS and the Lutheran Church is drastically behind in the media space. And that's not to take away from issues, etc., UO, Brian Wolfmeal. Like, there's people that are doing this. But for instance, if you go to the Catholic Church, who's probably one of the best ones, they've got well over 100 channels that have over 100,000 subscribers. Many have over 1 million, and wow. And then most of those are well above 100,000 too. So they're a bigger church body, yes. But if you were to take that and reverse engineer that back to the Lutheran Church,
we're not there.
We're drastically behind. And the proof's in the pudding, and you could go into some of the numbers or examples, which, I won't necessarily take the time to do, but that this is a very necessary way to engage, particularly millennials. Gen X is thrown into there too, but millennials, Gen Z, people are engaging in the media space. And many Catholics have found a way to, Pints with Aquinas is the one that we first reverse engineered, and then Word on Fire is another one that's more associated with what we're trying to do with lit, right? But they're putting intellectually serious things out into the space where that is heavily demanded. And what they're doing a lot of things. One, there's a huge conversion towards Catholicism through this, okay? Like these resources, right? And they're always pushing people towards, go to mass and find your local parish. But then also what they've done is they've been able to because of the kind of momentum behind this, now you find like Bishop Barron sitting with Jordan Peterson on his roundtable discussion on the Gospels, for instance. Right. So now there's like a plug-in where now the Catholic Church is being represented in this like very, very widespread space that's hitting seekers, agnostics, Christians across the board. And if you've got like a seeker that's kind of becoming interested in Christianity and is somewhat intellectually oriented, and they come across Bishop Barron in this structure, which church are they going to? They're going to go to the Catholic Mass. They're not going to stumble across the Lutheran Church. And that's exactly what you have to do. If you're entering through this space, is you kind of have to stumble upon. Once again, I'm not taking away from issues, et cetera, because they do have a huge following, and they have done this throughout their time in a very big way. So I'm not trying to minimize that. But once again, 100 channels, well over 100 channels, over 100,000 subscribers. We were not in the long and more, yeah. And we were not in the long form space, and there's a couple other spaces that we haven't gotten into, and that's part of our kind of growth plan, or is to use your words, like it's part of our vision. So it was really a reverse engineering aspect, our approach, and it's certainly served well so far. We've exceeded some of our goals, but I mean, maybe if I can put it in two other ways. One, you can have truth, which we have, right? But you have to be able to express it within beauty. Right. So it needs to be expertly done, expertly professed, and we need to take that very seriously. We need to be shrewd as serpents in this way and be very, very smart and diligent in how we get that message out. Right. If you have the truth and you hide it underneath a rock, okay, like good for you. You got the truth. So so that's what I would say is kind of what led to this.
And you've been able to meet a lot of unique people, right? You've expanded that's what I love about podcasts is I get to make friends with people that I may not have been friends with. And do you have an intention? I mean, you invited me on, but is there kind of across the spectrum of the LCMS in all of our various contexts? And is that a part of your aim to try and be a bridge builder at all? Yeah, go ahead, Bryan. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's certainly built into it. And to be honest, like we have had some people from other denominations on too. We're working a little bit more on that. We've reached out to a handful of people, and a couple have said yes that we'll have on in the future. So we do kind of want these, like, across the board dialogues. I think that's very helpful. So for lit, for example, we've got Bierman from St. Louis. We've got Beckman and I'm going to go through the names. So we've got
Adam Kuntz,
Classical College, both seminaries, and the Concordia system covered, along with some other areas. So that is kind of our goal. We do want to unite this. We do not want to be a fragmented podcast. That being said, our first mover, our first goal is intellectual conversations. And I kind of take the Joe Rogan approach of, what are you interested in, right? So when I find someone who's like written a book or an article or speaking on something or is recommended based on something, I say, that's something I would like to learn more about. That's kind of the first mover is that. And one of the things we've learned is you can almost track it. And for the most part, the more intellectually heavy the topic is, the more views, the more average duration, the more engagement. So one of the theories as we started was throw out this idea that you need to kind of like tailor things down, like, teach it at like a freshman and high school level. And I think that's been that's been disproven in the public spectrum. When you look at who are the popular speakers, they use intellectual language. They're very articulate. They're tackling with deep ideas. And that was kind of our theory at first. And we found that when you've got someone who's dealing with a very deep topic and diving deep, people are very much engaged in that. We've got a very intellectual audience here in the LCMS, which is good. And then trying to leverage that and build on that.
Love it. What have you learned about the LCMS in having the range of conversations you've had? What are your biggest takeaways?
Yeah, the first one would be that we, and that's what I think you would say that just historically looking at the Lutheran Church, you would say we're a very intellectually heavy church. Like, if you look at even just the numbers for schools in America, like we shoot far above our waist. Like, as far as the amount of schools we have, like we take education very seriously. When you look at the way we articulate doctrine, like the Book of Concord and such, like we dot our I's and cross our T's. We're not kind of flippant, like I've got a good friend from the EV Free Church, and he was a pastor there. And what, his story that's really interesting is he kind of came across the early church and found that the sacraments were important. And he was kind of wrestling with this, and he would kind of teach on this. And then he started talking to a senior pastor about it. And the senior pastor's like, yeah, like, I don't think there's really much to the sacraments, but you can think that, right? So it was like two pastors who have completely different views on the sacraments, and that's okay, right? That's not in the LCMS. Like we make sure that we are intellectually forward, and we dot our I's and cross our T's theologically. So that's in our makeup. And I think we need to be able to articulate and feed into that in this public realm. And the data has shown again that is actually true. Like our lay people they're intellectual heavyweights, right? And they want to wrestle with these things and be able to articulate those things. So that's one. Two, we've got great resources. And by that, I mean, we've aired, I think 69 episodes or something. So we probably recorded 79 or 80. And across the board, I just come across people that are very impressive in all sorts of different ways. I mean, your wisdom on leadership training, and your doctorate's degree there, like that's a great resource. We've got people that are experts in the early church, experts on ethics. I mean, across the board, these are voices that are quite profound. And, so that's one of those goals, is to give them an opportunity for you to learn from these individuals who have a ton to teach, and the wider world could value from that. So we've got a gold mine of wisdom, right here that we want to share with the world.
I couldn't agree more. How do we keep from collectively becoming arrogant with what we have? And what do you have that you haven't received? Paul says, right? Mm-hmm. There's nothing that isn't coming down from above, and to whom much is given, much is required. And how do our intellectual heavyweights continue to offer what they've come to deeply believe in, but recognize this is the power of, I think, a posture of humility. Recognize that in knowing something about this topic, leadership development, culture, healthy system structures, that kind of stuff. There's because that's where I've spent a lot of time. There's a whole host of other topics that I don't know, and I got to learn. And that's why I think you and I both have the same approach. It's like, oh my goodness, the world is so amazing. Mm-hmm. And there's no end to what we can learn. And the end result being, Bryan, that, wow, I know pretty much, I'm a big deal, Anchorman. because I know, something about something, but no, the end result should be, I know so little about most things, right? If you've done deep work. And I think there could be this collective arrogance in the LCMS that we must guard against, or else we may end up making idols out of our intellect rather than the one who has given us our intellect. Bryan, anything to say there?
Yeah, probably three thoughts. First to kind of to that curiosity point, I think Chesterton says the chief sin, and he's being a little bit satirical here, right? It's Chesterton, so he's not actually saying this is like the prime sin, but he's saying one of the chief sin is boredom. Right. In other words, like like the whole world around you is amazing, and there's so many other people that have so much to offer, like curiosity, and I think that's the one skill set that helps me most. It's the curiosity. Where when I sit down, to your point, like I'm almost always, maybe always, the least smart person in the room when I sit down with a guest. Right. And I love that because there's just this wealth of knowledge that I can be curious and learn from. Right. So that helps in that realm. One, two, I'll say maybe two other things on this. So. Two, arrogance, not the right word. I'm trying to think of like the right word, but there should be, I'm going to use arrogance, and I'm not using this as like the correct term. I just don't have another word, but there should be a little bit of arrogance. In that, I mean, like there's swagger. That's the right word. Like there should be some swagger and confidence. It's in the same way to where like when you're preaching, it's not swagger, like you're egotistical, but there's this like swagger and confidence, and like, this is the truth. Like this is the most beautiful thing. And we get to learn about it. We get to study about it here at church. So there's like this confidence of like if you go out there and you listen to the other thinkers that are around in your community, like they don't have this to offer. And it doesn't mean Bryan Stecker's offering it. It means we're discussing it and the Holy Spirit is bringing it here. So that's the one, like I would say there should be some of this, like, yes, like we do have this beautiful gift and we're confident in it. So there should be a little bit of that. To this third point, which, is kind of the caveat to that, right, is when you look at if you go to the, 7 deadly sins, you've got pride. Pride is number one. When you go through the 3 temptations in the wilderness, pride seems to be the pinnacle, along with kind of this desire for honor. If you kind of go through the 3, the flesh, the desire for honor, the desire for power. So we should always be wary of where does that boastfulness goes. And Paul speaks to that. It's like, I'm going to boast in the gospel, right? That's right. So for Lutherans, you should be able to say, what we have here is a proper framework so that the gospel does not get muddled. And so that this good news and the truth, the goodness, and the beauty can be properly exposed. And we should boast in that. We should boast boldly and confidently, right? And raise your head up high as you have it. And at the same point, if you're boasting in that which you have received, it can't lead to like an intellectual boasting of like look at me, right? So it's all about kind of that orientation of that. With the two issues being, if you minimize both, and you become kind of passive, or like, or if you kind of elevate yourself and then you become the egotistical megalomaniac.
Yeah, good. So Jesus has so much confidence.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Jesus he trusts fully in the Father's mission, and he holds that confidence in a way that draws people nearer. They're curious about Jesus. It's very obvious he can do things and say things from a position of profound authority. And that's what the Pharisees are kind of looking at. Who gives you that authority? Well, it kind of came down. I mean, we're pretty close. Me and the Father are pretty close, right? But the way it drew not just the disciples, the power of invitation, come and follow me, but it absolutely changed the whole world as the apostles went out as eyewitnesses of the crucified and risen one with the appropriate level of confidence in their message. Don't worry, it's not going to be you speaking. It's going to be the Holy Spirit speaking. But it was a winsome, invitational, come learn with me. Come meet, I love this. Come meet the one, this is woman at the well, who told me everything I've done. And the people in the town in Samaria are like, everything? Like, yeah, everything. Could this be the promised Messiah, And so I think that keeps us from hubris. That keeps us from arrogance. There's a spirit of invitation. We're courageous. We know our identity, to be sure. There's no way we're falling off in the LCMS on the passive side. We could become, is our brand, and I had a conversation about brand too. The name LCMS, what that means, is it an invitational group of people who are gathering together? Yes, with profound intellect, etc., and a profound history and tradition. Are we inviting more people who are outside of that tradition, who LCMS means very little in terms of their identity marker? And obviously there's way more people that are there in our communities than identify with who we are. Are our congregations and our leaders and our intellectuals offering offering what we have with an open invitational hand. That will keep us from hubris, keep us from arrogance. Any response to that, Bryan?
No, that was beautifully put. I think that's, yeah. I mean, you made the better point than I did because you went right to Jesus as that, the telos and the perfect example. So I think that's spot on. Thank you.
Hey, so good. All right. Let's close with this question here. As you look, as I bring up the LCMS, as you look at us, what is our unfair advantage? Because I think there are many. Our unfair advantage as you compare us with kindness and charity to other denominations, Catholic to charismatic, everywhere in between, as you compare us, though, to other mainline denominations and the rise of non-denominational churches. And I say all that in the context of only about 15% of people being in a Catholic or Lutheran or non-denom in my community. With this blows my mind, Bryan, the growth in our community, right? With 1,000 people moving into Maricopa County every single week. And that's
a point. That is when I heard you mention that before, and that's
I mean, it's mind blowing. It's the size of our Sunday worshiping community every single week, moving into the East Valley, and more of them. Here's one of my struggles in our struggles here as a congregation. It's like how do we create awareness about we're a Christian church, we're in a traditional, what may look to some of you like Catholic, but let me tell you the other story of grounding why we do the things we do. And sometimes I feel in this market where you've got non-denom churches who will start another multi-site, Bryan, this blows my mind, and launch one of their multi-sites with a community of worshiping 1,000 people first Sunday. And 500 end up sticking, and because they have strategies to buy lots of land, and not to mention our Mormon neighbors here, right? Buy lots of land, very strategic, long range thinkers. And sometimes I don't know that our strategy is following as much of our theology. Do we have that sort of a vision in all of our, especially urban, suburban communities and other communities in between? To say, wow, we need more churches right now. I think that could be an opportunity for growth for us, but there is a strategic unfair advantage, and I think it's our theology, which is so great. What do you think about our unfair advantage right now in the wider Christian landscape, Bryan?
Yeah, no, that was I've heard you speak on that before, and it's been one of those. It gets planted here, and I just keep trying to wrestle with your situation here. And ours is a little bit different. We're a growing community, but it's a Lutheran, more saturated area. So yeah, kind of the fair, kind of maybe playing both sides there.
Let's go.
Right. So what's the fair? There's the obvious ones, and you articulated it, and I'll kind of skip past it, not to minimize it, but because the theology. I think one thing that we can leverage more is we're watching, particularly like in the younger groups, we're watching like a swing towards traditionalism, and it's not just in the church. It's kind of throughout. You can even watch it. Mormon's very fast growing. They're a good example. Kind of the interest in like ancient spiritual practices. If you go on YouTube, you get a lot of these like ancient Buddha meditation techniques and stuff like that. A little bit of that's new age, but a lot of it too is just this. There's this intrigue. There's this recognition by people that we've got a fractured society that's lost its kind of groundwork. So people start to search backwards and they say, where's that firm ground? And that moves them back traditionally, right? So sometimes they go back to like the real ancient, or they go to the Eastern, and they're looking for that. So if you look at the landscape of churches, that moving desire means that, despite the very valid data point that you're talking about with some of these mega churches, which is, sometimes when you just get large, there's a multiplication effect. So that's kind of that's one thing to table. But the movement isn't traditional, which means Catholics, Orthodox, and LCMS Lutherans have an advantage there. Right. Other ones that have gone more modern, and by modern I mean like they've adopted modernist type philosophies, women's ordination, things like that. Like that is going to hurt them in the long run, and it's, I think, numerically hurting them already. We have demographic issues. I think they have theological issues on top of probably already demographic issues. So that's something to leverage. Now, what's the challenge to that? Well, how do you get people to know that? Right. And that's certainly, I think, part of your mission and my mission is like, okay, so people get interested in that. And they go watch Father, what's his name, from the Orthodox Church, who articulates it wonderfully. And young men are like, there it is. Like, there's like the restoration of masculinity and like the proper ordering of the household and all of this kind of stuff. And they get excited about that. And so they're going Orthodox, or they see Bishop Barron or Pints with Aquinas, and they get drawn into the Catholic. And that's kind of, it's my shtick, but I truly believe it, right? Like, we need to be in that space to show to the public, like, well, like, what's Lutheranism? This is Lutheranism, right? And it's serious because people want to take something seriously. It's not stuffy, like, it doesn't, serious doesn't have to be stuffy. Traditional doesn't have to be boring or anything like that, right? It's the exact opposite. There's this vibrancy. So that's the gem that we have. And the challenge is, how do we articulate it? And that leads to the challenges. And the one that I would probably highlight the most is articulating this externally, putting it out there in front of people so that there's access points where people can say, never really heard about Lutheranism, but like, that's a compelling case. Oh, they're interested in the early church. And, you can just kind of play into that. And then the other one, which is not an area of expertise in my area, I think this is probably more in your lane, but I think there's very valid questions that you're asking as far as, we've got 1,000 people coming in. Like, what do we do about that? And that's above my pay grade. And I'm not plugged in enough to know, like, what are those strategies, right? Like, they don't call Bryan Stecker up, the associate pastor in Minnesota, and say, like, just so you know, here's what's going on in California, right? So I'm not privy to those conversations.
Well, they don't call me up either.
They don't call you up. But like, those are serious things. Like, we need to be shrewd as serpents, right? And we need to take very seriously like entrepreneurial, endeavors and trying, like, taking that seriously and saying, we got to jump at those things. So I think that's a valid thing as well. I don't have a ton of answers to that outside of kind of my realm that I'm leaning into, because, I've studied this now enough, but there's a lot of other ones. And that's where you need those voices that are skilled in that area to say, here's opportunities, and let's capitalize on those opportunities and jump at those opportunities.
And I've said publicly now that I'm not talking about pastoral formation. And so I'm not. This podcast has, though, talked about some cultural and long-range strategic concerns for us multiplying the message of Christ crucified in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is what I'm praying for. I'm praying for diverse perspectives. And some of those conversations, I pray more, there's an invitational spirit for more and more of those conversations about some of our pain points to be taking place privately. And if it makes sense, for the help of the church, for some folks with diverse perspectives, I've been told that podcasts is not the appropriate place for some diverse perspective conversations in the LCMS. And so we're going to do the best we can to talk about what the church wants to talk about. And sometimes they're a little more on the edge, I guess you may say. But I'm not afraid. Like, all of my conversations in my local church, there's lots of edgy conversations that pastors talk about, like, all the time, So it doesn't feel for me like a different thing when I'm talking about something that's going on in the life of the wider church. But I know for some, it feels like a different and maybe even a divisive thing. And if you know my heart, Bryan, this is why I love being with you. That's the last thing I would want to do. We are an entrepreneurial community here that like to test new things. Not that everybody else should be doing what we're doing, but yeah, we'll see how it all kind of plays out. And I know you and I both share this. We would love to see more unity in the LCMS toward our one another, obviously, and then united in our mission to make Jesus known, and united obviously around Scripture and confessions. Any more comments there, Bryan?
Yeah, maybe two. Just a plug to say, like, I appreciate having a line with you and vice versa. And we've talked about some things over the phone, right, and whatnot. And I mean, when you were on, you threw your cell phone number out there, right? Say, like, hey, like, if you've got things, you can call me up and talk about it. Like, if you've got challenging thoughts or whatever. But no, I appreciate that. And that more of that, I think, is good. Right. So, like, if there's something like that Tim says where I'm like, I don't know about that, or vice versa, where you're like, Bryan, like, what were you getting at there? Like, just taking the time to talk there. One, I just want to endorse that, and to endorse that you're very willing to do that. You do it with me, and you've shared stories of doing it with others. So I want to endorse that publicly. And then one other thought is you were talking about, just one other advantage of the LCMS is when you were on, you were talking about in the ELCA, right? How they're having conversations on the divinity of Christ, right? Like, that's so
significant.
Like, groups within, like, their synod that are arguing about that. Like, that's like, I can't imagine that. So there's one, like, we don't know how good we have it in that. Like, I can understand the ELCA splitting over something like the divinity of Christ, but when it comes to the LCMS, I'm like, like, we're having important discussions, and sometimes Bryan has to be like, what, I was saying this, and I might be wrong, or, so there's all these examples. But at the same point, like, we're not arguing over the divinity of Christ or the the article of justification. So in many ways, we have it really good, and I think that's because of the theological acumen, that, like, we're not arguing about these ridiculous things. And sometimes we need to just kind of remember, like people do disagree on things, and that, like, we should debate these things. But at the same point, like we're very healthy in that as like an LCMS. And like, I just don't see any reasonable reasons for like a split or anything like that. To where it's like, when I look at the ELC, I'm like, you guys might split over the divinity of Christ, right? So I do appreciate that we should recognize that concordance that I think is there.
Amen. Hey, Bryan, this has been great, dude. I'm grateful for your friendship, partnership in the gospel, for the way God made you, and for your desire to put it on the line. People, you should follow On the Line. It's wonderful, and all the range of guests you're having, praying for you and your ministry, your family, your new little one coming. If people want to connect with you, what's your just like church email? If people wanted to, because I get this from time to time. Hey, have you talked to so-and-so? No. Okay. Yeah. If someone wants to recommend or just connect with you, how can they do so?
Yeah. ontheline.net is the best way because the contact information's on there. So that's
Beautiful.
A good place to just, if you want to go access it, obviously our website at Trinity, but that's probably the best place. I mean, unless if anyone's got a pen and they're going to write it on Bryan.Stecker at trinitywaconia.org.
That's a little longer.
Yeah. So just check out the website and you'll find my contact information on there.
Hey, this is good, man. This is Lead Time. Like, subscribe, comment, wherever it is you take in these podcasts. And it was an upward moving conversation. We're growing together. I learned more about C.S. Lewis today. That was super, super fun. And I'm, again, just grateful for our partnership in the gospel, praying for you and for more churches like Trinity that want to raise up leaders, newer, younger pastors, and say, hey, if you got a vision, let's see about accomplishing that vision. Our congregation is the same way with the Unite Leadership Collective. Let's see about releasing young leaders into a creative adventure and to see how it all shakes out. It's shaking out really, really well for you, Bryan, and praise be to God. It's a good day. Go and make it a great day. Thanks, Bryan.
Thanks, Tim.
You've been listening to Lead Time, a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective. The ULC's mission is to collaborate with the local church to discover, develop, and deploy leaders through biblical Lutheran doctrine and innovative methods. To partner with us in this gospel message, subscribe to our channel, then go to theuniteleadership.org to create your free login for exclusive material and resources, and then to explore ways in which you can sponsor an episode. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for next week's episode.